Thank you again for joining. Today's webinar is titled Data-Driven Implementation of Tiered Interventions with English Learners. This is session 3 of a 3-part webinar series hosted by the Connecticut English Learner Research Partnership at REL Northeast Islands. Again, my name is Ashley Gaddis, and I'm the Dissemination Manager here. Here you can see an overview of this workshop series. Session 1 was on February 1st, Session 2 on March 1st, and today is Session 3. As I said earlier, we will be focusing our work today on identifying appropriate data-based interventions for English learners. And we will have some time at the end, as we did with all of the webinars, to do some team planning for next steps. Here you can see we have 2 learning goals for today's webinar. Our goals are to engage instructors in understanding how to implement RTI, or scientific-based research interventions, to improve instruction for English learner students. Another goal is to engage educators in understanding how to use data through instructional methods to improve the identification of culturally and linguistically diverse exceptional learners. And these are actually the overarching goal for the entire 3-part webinar series. Here is today's agenda. We will begin with a welcome and introductions. Next, we will be focusing on identifying appropriate interventions for English learners in Tiers 2 and 3. Next, we will talk about developing Individualized Education Programs, or IEPs, for English learners. We will, towards the end of the webinar, leave some time for you to do some team planning as a group, and then we will have closing remarks. Also, throughout the webinar, there will be different interactions and activities and handouts for you to work on. This webinar is hosted by the Connecticut English Learner Research Partnership, facilitated by REL Northeast Islands. You can see here that the long-term goal of this partnership is to examine data use in 2 specific areas. One is the identification of disabilities among English learner students, and that is why this webinar series is taking place and resources were put towards it. And another piece is to examine data use in the provision of high-quality instruction that meets the diverse needs of the English learner student population. So as you can see, the big focus on working with English learners and English learners with disabilities. Here are the goals for today's session: to equip participants with the knowledge and skills to make better informed data-driven decisions regarding appropriate interventions for English learner students in Tiers 2 and 3. To reflect on the content covered during all 3 sessions, as this is a concluding webinar, and then to identify concrete next steps that you can use in your schools and districts for applying strategies, recommendations, and considerations in the local context, in your local context, particularly related to data sources and their use. And here are today's 2 presenters, Sarah Moore and Lindsey Massoud. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who will begin her presentation. Have a great session, Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much. We're delighted to be here for this final session in our series, Data-Driven Implementation of Tiered Interventions with English Learners. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're excited to follow up and wrap up. These are the key sources we've used throughout the series, and we'll also be drawing on them today. They are 2 IES practice guides, assisting students struggling with reading, response to intervention, and multi-tier intervention in the primary grades, and teaching academic content to English learners in elementary and middle school. Also the OELA English Learner Toolkit, as well as the Capel Handbook on SRBI for ELs, which is the scientific research-based interventions for English language learners, a handbook to accompany Connecticut's framework for RTI. For today's session, we'll also draw on a fairly new guide from the CCSSO about English learners with disabilities. So let's talk about identifying appropriate interventions for English learners in Tiers 2 and 3. First, let's briefly review the 3 tiers of response to intervention. In Tier 1, students receive high-quality classroom instruction. For English learners, this would mean provision of ESOL services, as well as culturally and linguistically responsive instruction. In Tier 2, students receive supplemental instruction. So for English learners, this would mean interventions that are differentiated to meet language and content learning needs, as well as involvement of ESOL staff. In Tier 3, students receive intensive interventions. So for English learners, this would involve curriculum modifications based on learning needs, including English language development, staff training and working with English learners, and involvement of an ESOL specialist. So across the tiers, educators should conduct screening, assessment, and progress monitoring. So for English learners, this would include involvement of an ESOL specialist, assessment and screening tools that have been both researched with English learners and also those which are available in students' native languages, if that's possible, of course, making comparisons with true peers, and consideration of a broad range of data, including, of course, English learners' English proficiency levels. So in revisiting some of our conversations from the last session, before we dive in today, let's take a few minutes to talk through the kinds of Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports you've implemented with English learners in your schools or districts. Maybe you've done some of this as a result of some of the discussions we've had over the last 2 sessions. So we'll give you about 2 minutes to chat, and once you've discussed, please post your thoughts in the chat box, and we'll do a little group debrief. In the next couple slides, we'll revisit Isabel and Adnan as well as your student. So thinking about them as examples might help to sort of generate thinking and discussion around your consideration of this chat. Okay, well, we can presume that there is rich discussion being carried out in your individual sites as we move through this exciting continued presentation about data-driven decision-making. So we'll move on in the interests of time. Unless folks have thoughts, go ahead and post them in the existing chat box and we can maybe revisit. So as I mentioned, let's reconsider Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports for Adnan, Isabel, and your case study student. So in thinking back on Isabel's background and the data we've reviewed to distinguish between language-based versus other learning challenges, what Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports might be appropriate to support her needs? Talk with your colleagues for a couple more minutes, and then share your thoughts in the chat box. Great. I see that East Hartford. Perfect. More specific information on her struggles with literacy. Well, it is difficult with just the limited information that we have. Fortunately, one of the recommendations from the IES Practice Guide that we're going to discuss involves facilitating literacy development. And I think that would apply to Isabel's case. South Windsor and Hartford Public Schools, looks like you're sharing some thoughts. Yeah, Tier 2 reading intervention. And then for Adnan, you say nothing at this point, but check English learner instruction to ensure that he has daily push and supports as well as explicit instruction. Yes, absolutely. And we'll talk about ensuring that interventions are occurring not only in the push-in general education setting, in addition to pull out if that's the program model that's being used in a particular setting. And Hartford Public Schools said we would consider the following interventions: foundational skill interventions, chunking materials, yes, absolutely, and that's something that we'll talk about a little later on in the session. And then modifying text complexity, yes, and chunking materials is, of course, one way to get at that. Hartford Public Schools says reciprocal teaching on memory devices. Absolutely, yeah, I think that would help, particularly in terms of the challenges that we've seen from Isabel. Okay, I think we'll wait for Torrington Public Schools, and then we'll move on to Adnan. Okay. Continue ESL pullout and consider having Isabel also meet with a literacy coach. Yeah, that's a great idea, and additional time with the English learner specialist. Great. So let's move to thinking about Adnan. And thinking about his background and the data that we've reviewed in terms of distinguishing between language-based versus other learning challenges, what Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports might be appropriate for supporting his needs? So talk with your colleagues for about 2 minutes again and share your thoughts, and we'll discuss further. Hartford Public Schools, working with general education teachers to support interventions. Absolutely, and that's a lot of that need is in large part the genesis of this series of sessions, is intentionally involving not only ESOL specialists, but also general education teachers, as well as literacy experts, special education experts. So it's really about coming together as a team and ensuring that we're taking into account the multifaceted considerations of these kids' backgrounds and data sources for distinguishing between language versus other learning challenges. So Tammy says, since he is a refugee, making sure his social and emotional needs are being met, absolutely. That's critically important for kids who have come from refugee or students with limited or interrupted formal education backgrounds, that we account for social and emotional learning supports. And we'll talk about that when we discuss considerations for all students when implementing interventions versus considerations particularly for English learners. East Hartford Public Schools says check his native language literacy skills. Yes, and this is something that again has come up repeatedly and consistently as we've had these discussions, the dearth of available resources related to native language literacy assessment and native language in general proficiency assessment. We'll wait for Torrington Public Schools and then we'll move on. East Hartford, oh, we had already talked about that, checking native language literacy skills. So Torrington suggests that we do not refer Adnan for any Tier 1 or Tier 2 supports because he has not been in the country for long enough. We would take him more of an individualized coaching from an ESL teacher. That's an excellent point and one that I think for which there's salience across these series, and it really gets at the importance of varied data sources. And this is a very general example of sort of demographic background and personal background that's really fundamentally important in making these decisions around whether we are going to, in fact, engage in and implement interventions. So let's take a few minutes to just glance back at your notes in the handouts from last time and our first session. If you've been thinking about one or more students with whom you've worked in your particular school or district, and how what we've been discussing and what we'll be discussing today might apply to them and provision of supports for them that are needs responsive. So in the next two sections, we'll review recommendations from 3 of today's resources. The IES Practice Guide, which is assisting students struggling with reading, response to intervention and multi-tier intervention in the primary grades. Scientific research-based interventions for English language learners, a handbook to accompany Connecticut's framework for RTI. And finally, the IES Practice Guide, teaching academic content to English learners in elementary and middle school. So in the IES Practice Guide on RTI, the third recommendation is for teachers to provide intensive, systematic instruction on up to 3 foundational reading skills. This should occur in small groups of students who score below the benchmark on universal screening. The guide also recommends that these homogeneous groups consist of 3 to 4 students and use curricula that address key components of the target skills. So instruction should be systematic and build over time. It suggests 3 particular practices to carry out this recommendation. First, use a curriculum that addresses the components of reading instruction, and this gets at some of the thoughts and recommendations that you posted, that some of you posted in the chat earlier. This includes phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency, and should also relate to students' needs and developmental levels. Second, implement this program for 3 to 5 times a week for approximately 20 to 40 minutes. And finally, build skills gradually and provide a high level of teacher-student interaction with opportunities for practice and feedback. The Capel SRBI for English Learners publication provides guidance on monitoring progress when implementing tiered instruction. First, of course, use the data sources we've reviewed over the past 2 sessions. As we've discussed, however, use caution to ensure that multiple data sources are reviewed that represent a range of oral and written language and literacy skills. The Capel publication suggests that when considering Tier 2 interventions for potentially dually identified English learners, teachers should separate students into small groups of, again, ideally 3 to 5 students, and make sure the content and activities are decisively different than those which were involved in Tier 1 instruction. So intervention should be conducted 5 days a week, again, 8 to 10 weeks, in 20 to 40, maybe 30-minute mini lessons. As interventions are implemented, educators should use data to determine whether students are making adequate progress. And if by the end of the intervention they have made appropriate progress, of course, then they should be removed from the intervention and returned to Tier 1 instruction. If there is only some progress, students should be regrouped, and the Tier 2 intervention should be rerun. If there is very little progress, educators should consult with colleagues and consider moving to more intensive intervention activities in Tier 3. So the Capel publication on SRBI suggests that when implementing Tier 2 interventions with students who are English learners, teachers should take into account a few considerations in terms of what interventions would look like for all students versus for those who are English learners. So for example, English learners in Tier 2 instruction may vary in time and intensity from Tier 1. Content may not be matched well to English learners' backgrounds, including their academic, socio-emotional, and or behavioral needs, which is what sort of refers back to some of the discussions we had about Adnan. So teachers should make adaptations to account for these mismatches, such as using systematic and explicit instruction, including modeling, numerous examples, and varied opportunities for sharing feedback. We should focus on academic language and vocabulary instruction with numerous opportunities for practice. And we should provide frequent and structured opportunities for students to further develop their oral language skills. So additional considerations when implementing Tier 2 interventions have to do with grouping and student-to-teacher ratios, which may be more varied when working with English learner students. For example, non-English learners would be grouped homogeneously, so students with similar needs, with a teacher-to-student ratio of up to 1 to 4 or 1 to 6. But when working with English learners, it may be difficult to group homogeneously if there are no true peers available, for example. Teacher-to-student ratios might be much smaller or larger if there are few students or limited staff available with expertise in schools or in districts. In addition, when implemented for all students, Tier 2 interventions would be based on the Common Core state standards, but when working with English learners, interventions would also need to account for the linguistic demands that are embedded in standards and other curricula and instruction. So teachers, therefore, should consider the following when implementing Tier 2 with English learners. Address specific reading and math skills as determined, again, by available data. Incorporate reading, writing, listening, and speaking in authentic contexts. Involve reinforcement, repetition, practice, and redundancy of vocabulary skills and strategies taught in core reading and math lessons. To inform consideration of what Tier 2 supports might look like in the classroom, we've drawn from the IES Practice Guide, Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners in Elementary and Middle School. The authors recommend that English learners benefit from word learning strategies to help them figure out the meaning of words. Ways to do this might include context clues, teaching about word parts, or referencing cognates. In addition to providing direct instruction on academic vocabulary words, teach students to independently figure out the meaning of unknown words by using context clues, word parts, again, morphology, and cognates. So, before we move on to discussions of Tier 3, let's chat briefly with our colleagues about what we just discussed with regard to Tier 2 instruction. Based on what we've just discussed, what's one action step you would want to take for designing and implementing Tier 2 interventions with English learners? Maybe chat for 2 or 3 minutes, and then share or post your thoughts to the chat box. So keep chatting about one action step that you might want to take for designing and implementing Tier 2 interventions. Okay, it looks like Hartford Public Schools and Bloomfield are typing their action steps. Excellent, yes. So Bloomfield is recommending that We develop an English language plan, I presume, an ELP similar to an IEP with clear goals and assessment criteria. I think it's very important, particularly in these scenarios where we don't have access, for example, to native language proficiency assessments on levels, and we don't have access to other assessments in students' native languages, that we set clear objectives and benchmarks so that we have guideposts from which to implement instruction to accurately assess the extent to which we're accomplishing the goals and objectives we've set out. So Hartford Public Schools look at student time in a program of an English learner and other data from different assessments and create a plan for students with specific goals. Again, yes, plan. We got that. Yes, absolutely. Again, I think a lot of this comes down to being very careful and deliberate and strategic about planning and taking into account, again, the numerous sources of data that inform the development of our plans. And then along the way, being very careful to engage in this progress monitoring steps, and then designing actions based on what we're finding as we're conducting and engaging in progress monitoring. So Tammy Swift says, document what interventions have already been done and make sure new strategies and interventions are done with fidelity. Yes, absolutely. I think often we're challenged when we're working with English learners who we're considering maybe duly identified or culturally and linguistically diverse, exceptional students with a lack of consistency and coherence across the resources available to serve them. And again, that speaks to the need to have experts from several different areas, including special education experts and English learner experts and maybe literacy experts, who all together are working collaboratively and, of course, consulting other key involved individuals like parents, for example. East Hartford Public Schools explored different ways to group our English learners together for interventions. Yeah, absolutely. We've talked a lot about, and this is a similar point, Hartford Public Schools says assess who their like peers are in order to measure student progress. And that's what I was just going to say, is we've talked a lot about the importance of true peers or like peers, and ensuring that our point of reference for students is appropriate. Because if we're not starting from appropriate and reasonable, realistic point of reference, then the other assessments that we're sort of making around these students may or may not be really valid. Those are all excellent points, and we hope that some of these action steps will be followed after the conclusion of today's session. So we're going to move on. So in the IES Practice Guide on RTI, the fifth and final recommendation refers to what to do in Tier 3. Provide intensive instruction daily that promotes the development of various components of reading proficiency to students who show minimal progress after reasonable time in Tier 2 small group instruction. This recommendation includes focusing on a small number of high priority skills in a one-on-one or small group setting. So regular progress monitoring can demonstrate whether the program is working for the students or whether changes need to be made. It recommends practices to carry out this recommendation, and these are to implement concentrated instruction that is focused on a small but targeted set of reading skills, adjust the overall lesson pace, schedule multiple and extended instructional sessions daily, include opportunities for extensive practice and high-quality feedback with one-on-one instruction, planned and individualized Tier 3 instruction using input from a school-based RTI team. So again, here we are with the importance of that team. and ensure that Tier 3 students master a reading skill or strategy before moving on. When is a special education referral appropriate? If an English learner does not make progress typical of true peers and has been through a minimum of 2 rounds of Tier 3 intervention with fidelity, then it's advisable to have the student assessed for the existence of any exceptionality. It's important to note, however, that federal and state guidance has reiterated that RTI, or SRBI, may not be used to delay or deny timely initial evaluations for students suspected of having a disability. A referral received at any time, regardless of the tier of intervention a child may be receiving, must be reviewed by a planning and placement team. So, Tier 3 interventions incorporate intensive and research-based small group instruction, additional time each day during, before, or after school, progress monitoring every week with instruction adjusted based on findings, all education personnel working together to assist the child, parents involved and provided with data about their child's performance, and assistance that may be both in the general classroom and in pull-out classrooms, which is similar to what someone had suggested earlier in one of our chat boxes. So the Capel publication on SRBI suggests that when implementing Tier 3 interventions with students who are English learners, teachers should take into account a few considerations in terms of what interventions should look like for all students versus those who are English learners. So first, when Tier 3 interventions are conducted with non-English learners, they are short-term, 8 to 20 weeks, and are well matched to students' specific academic, social behavioral needs. They are also more intensive and individualized than Tier 2 interventions. With English learners, interventions may include modified curriculum from Tiers 1 and 2 because students need additional language supports necessary for accessing core content. So therefore, curriculum and instruction must be further adapted to address English learners' specific language and content learning needs. So as we discussed earlier in terms of what Tier 3 interventions might look like with all students versus English learners, non-English learners' Tier 3 instruction would be delivered to homogeneous groups, so students with similar needs, with a teacher-to-student ratio of up to 1 to 3, and would be developed based on the Common Core state standards. For English learners, it may not be possible to deliver instruction to homogeneous groups, and the student-to-teacher ratios may vary depending on the English learners in a class or school, their backgrounds, and available instructional expertise. So when working with English learners, teachers should be sure to carefully and frequently monitor students' progress. And although content will, of course, also be based on Common Core state standards, it may also include new and different resources that account for students' language learning needs, as well as other language proficiency related standards. So again, drawing from the IES Practice Guide, Tier 3 interventions might involve provision of scaffolded instruction that includes frequent opportunities for students to practice and review newly learned skills and concepts in a range of contexts to promote retention. So to scaffold instruction, activities should be broken down into smaller, manageable units. Someone talked about this again also earlier in our chat, this notion of chunking. Rather than giving all of the instruction for the activity, begin with the description, then teachers might check for comprehension, and then continue the description. So we might be then breaking a task down into smaller parts when teaching complex tasks, such as listening comprehension and text-based comprehension. So teaching should also be explicit and systematic with ample modeling and think-alouds. English learners will benefit from structured instructions because they will recognize the various aspects that come in sequence. So we show students clearly how to perform a particular task and go over the steps with them, making sure that the thinking processes are overt and visible. So also, teachers in Tier 3 should be exceptionally careful to frequently check for understanding and integrate numerous diverse scaffolding strategies. So a Tier 3 intervention might also involve, given that English learners are more likely to have an incomplete understanding of instructions, paraphrasing complex instructions in a text to help everyone understand. So before I move on to discussion of IEPs, let's chat briefly with your colleagues about what we've discussed regarding Tier 3 instruction. So based on what we've just discussed, what's one action step you might take for designing and implementing Tier 3 interventions with English learners in your site or setting? Again, let's take about 2 minutes, and then we'll do a little large group debrief. So in thinking about action steps that you might take for designing and implementing Tier 3 interventions, folks might share what you've been discussing. So we see Hartford Public Schools is typing. So carefully analyze the data from Tier 2 instruction and design Tier 3 instruction to meet more individualized needs of the student. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, we've talked about the critical importance of ascertaining the extent to which we should be moving from one tier to the next, and ensuring that as we move, that moving from one tier to the next is in fact the appropriate next step, and a sort of basic area of need in so doing involves revisiting varied types of data sources. And again, ensuring that the data sources we are reviewing are valid and reliable and really genuinely represent a student's language, literacy, and content learning levels. So Tammy is typing. Yeah. So Tammy's pointing out that she thinks it's important to note that tiered interventions can go from 8 to 20 weeks, and sometimes we rush to the next tier after one round of 8 weeks. And again, it's being very cautious and careful around these database decisions that we're making, and the implications of what may happen in the next tier, and ensuring that we're not over or under identifying English learners who may or may not have exceptional needs. Yeah, I think in the context of already a very tight timelines in schooling in general, that's a really important point. So thank you, Tammy. Torrington Public Schools is typing. Okay. Once we hear from Torrington, we'll move on to just some general questions or comments or discussion before moving on to Lindsey's discussion of IEPs. Okay. We'll move on to our general questions. And one idea that Lindsey and I have been talking about as we were preparing for today's session is also thinking about ways in which we could incorporate English language development into Tier 3 or otherwise modify an intervention from something that you would typically do with an English-only student or a native English speaker, monolingual English-speaking student. So various strategies and activities that you might use more typically with monolingual English students, how would we adapt those so we could engage in the same intervention, but it would be appropriate for English learners? Anyone have thoughts in that area or other questions you'd like to share? Anyone have any thoughts about the point that Tammy brought up about timing of interventions in terms of number of weeks, for example? how that might vary. Depending on particular backgrounds or characteristics of an English learner. PSYOP strategies are great for general teaching, but several can be used for Tier 2 or Tier 3. Tiered vocabulary, yes, absolutely. Cal was a co-creator of the PSYOP model, and we have a robust PD team that implements PSYOP professional development and technical assistance supports, and absolutely we highly and often recommend utilizing PSYOP strategies that can then be adapted for culturally and linguistically exceptional students. Give maybe another minute, and then we'll move on to discussion of IEPs. Maybe folks have more thoughts on those as we get to a little bit more specific practice-based. So Tammy says teaching of phonics within context and keeping in mind native language sounds a student may or may not have, therefore phonics instruction should look different for English learners. Absolutely. Yes. And this is something that is, again, teaching about the various language parts for not only oral language development, but also literacy development. So yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Tammy. Okay, I think we'll move on, and Lindsey will take over. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And we're going to talk a little bit about IEPs for English learners. And so the first thing that I wanted to do with you all, we had sent this in an email. Hopefully, at least some of you got it. Maybe you had a chance to look at it. Maybe not. We totally understand if you have not. We understand being super busy for sure. So maybe you have some thoughts on it already. Maybe you have something new to share as we look at it. So as Ashley had mentioned earlier, if you want to download now the handout called IEP Checklist, or you can also download it from the link that I just posted in the chat. The IEP checklist is actually pages 11 and 12 of this document. This is Chapter 6, I believe, of the English Learner Toolkit from the Office of English Language Acquisition at the U.S. Department of Education. It has a lot of good tools in there. We went through tool number 2 in our previous session, and this is tool number 3 within that toolkit. There are a lot of recommended items within this checklist, 17 of them. Each of them can help us ensure we're addressing elements of IEP planning that may be specific to English learners. For example, considering English language proficiency, cultural background, and appropriate use of assessment and other data, as we've been discussing throughout this series. But we thought it would be useful to look at this together briefly so that we can do a little bit of thinking about what from this checklist do we already do and what's something that maybe we can do in the future. So if you guys can just have that open, that would be great for what we're about to do. Okay. So what we want to do now is look at this checklist together. If you're attending individually, look through the checklist based on what your school or district does. If you're attending as a team, discuss it with your team. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And identify one checklist item that your school or district already includes in the IEP development process for English learners, and then share an idea related to that area with the group in the chat box. And then the other chat box is for identifying a challenge related to implementing a different checklist item. Share that as a question with the group in that other chat box. Feel free to answer individually or as a team as usual, and just post in each of those chat boxes. So we know this might take a minute. We've got 2 minutes on the clock, but respond with your team and just let us know what questions you have and what ideas you have for implementing these items. Okay, so our 2 minutes are up. No one's responded yet. Hopefully you're having really rich discussions with your groups. I'll give you just a little bit more time to feel free to respond, but if you don't want to respond, that's fine. And I think we can just take this tool as something that we can take back to our context and maybe reflect on as a group. As usual, we've included in your handouts a page for identifying some next steps that you can do sort of in shorter and longer time periods. So this tool could be something that you might incorporate into those next steps when you do your team planning. Examining this along with your teammates and identifying something that you might want to do in your context could be one action step for following up on this series of sessions. Okay. So I was about to move us along, but I see Hartford is typing, so maybe it's just taking a little extra time for discussion. So we'll wait for a response or two, and then we'll move along and talk about some recommendations. And this is something, too, for others of you, if you have questions about this or comments, thoughts, as we continue to go through the presentation, you can always use the standard chat once we've moved out of this view as well. Oh, can you put the handout links back up? Yeah, Jenny. They are looking for the handout links. So I can post the link to the tool online. Oh yes, there she goes. Thank you, Jenny. So there you see it there, the IEP checklist is what we've titled it, but this is actually the entire Chapter 6 of the toolkit, and the checklist is on pages 11 and 12 of that document. All right, so Hartford has commented, through integration of the CALP standards, General Ed and TESOL specialists collaborate on planning progress monitoring. Fantastic. So that's great to hear. We love that you're using your English language proficiency standards and that the TESOL specialist is also involved. So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more in just a minute, that collaboration approach and some of the things that we can think about when we're trying to incorporate multiple people in the process. So fantastic. Okay, so I think we can move along. And we'll talk through some recommendations. We know there was a lot in that checklist, so it's something, like I said, that you might want to come back to later and do some thinking about. So we're going to talk through 4 recommendations that come from the CCSSO English Learners with Disabilities Guide that just came out last fall. We've found it very useful. It might be something that you could check out as well for your planning and sort of processing of some of the information that we've been discussing throughout this series. They have 4 key recommendations specifically regarding development of IEPs for English learners. Feel free to jot notes on page 2 of your handout if you have it there. Regarding practical steps you might take to implement the recommendations, you can take some notes as we go through, and then those can also play a role in your team planning following the session. So the first recommendation is that IEP teams should include a staff member who can address the impact of language and culture on students' goals and services. So this could be an ESOL specialist or someone else who has certification in bilingual education or English language development. So as we've discussed in previous sessions, and as Hartford just mentioned as well, it's important to understand how a student's performance is being impacted by their language abilities in both English and their home language. And an ESL specialist or other staff member with training and expertise regarding English learner education can offer a critical perspective on how language should be addressed within the IEP. So this recommendation critically entails greater involvement of ESOL staff and collaboration among educators with different specialties. So we wanted to spend just a couple of minutes to consider factors that can contribute to effective team-based decision making. We know this can be really difficult. Logistics get in the way, timing, and everyone's roles and whether you're at different schools and things like that. In thinking about how to create effective collaboration, we wanted to specifically look at these recommendations based on a report developed by the San Diego Unified School District. The report is based on the district's implementation of a special education project regarding establishment and study of the work of transdisciplinary teams, or they abbreviate it to TDTs, throughout their program, throughout the report. Their approach builds upon the theory that single discipline assessments provide a snapshot from a very limited perspective, but that interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary teams, wherein members convene to discuss assessment findings and form joint recommendations, can result in more child-centered assessment and can enhance the assessment and subsequent intervention. So definitely with English learners, we would love to see that with a specific focus on English learners and their language abilities. So one theme, I'll just highlight a few themes that I noticed across these recommendations, the characteristics of effective school-based teams. One theme is just mutual respect and open communication. So they cite positive open communication as an important characteristic of an effective school-based team, having respect for one another, willingness to be flexible and open-minded, which of course requires respecting the ideas that you hear from others, and general agreement on the mission or role of the team. So in other words, you have to be all on the same page, working toward a goal with a collaborative mindset. Another theme is the competence and organization of the work, that there's shared responsibility and accountability among team members, and no one's taking the bulk of the load. Team members have expertise, competence, good work ethic, everyone's committed and brings their own relevant areas of expertise. They also mentioned site-level administrative support, which I'm sure we can all recognize is critical to ensuring effectiveness of the work that we do. And then with scheduling, they recommend being on site together 1 day a week and meeting regularly, but that could be only 30 minutes a week. So we know even finding 30 minutes can be really, really tricky sometimes, but it's, according to them, you don't have to meet every day. You don't have to see each other constantly. Sometimes just a short time together weekly can be really useful. Yeah, so this report, I wanted to mention, I'm going to post a link for you. This report includes a lot of really useful resources in addition to these notes about collaboration. So they include a graphic conveying how transdisciplinary teams engage in data collection and problem solving. So a lot of the kinds of things that we've been talking about, they have a graphic displaying how that can work with diverse teams. They have a list of questions that can guide planning and interpretation meetings, so something that you could go through as a team. They have a number of templates for documenting team meetings and decision-making processes, and they have a meeting guide for team-based IEP development. So a lot of really rich resources about working as a team in developing IEPs and going through this process of looking at data collaboratively and analyzing it together, making decisions together. They also have guidance regarding conducting ethnographic interviews with parents. So on a slightly different topic, we'll be talking about parents in a minute, but I wanted to mention this here since we're talking about this report. We've talked a lot about getting information from parents, and this resource is one way that you might be able to sort of systematically engage parents around what's going on with their kid. Get information from people who know the student best in sort of a systematic way with some guidance from other educators who have been doing this. They also have a number of resources for performance-based assessment. So the report doesn't focus on English learners specifically, but it includes some resources and items that address English learners' skills in English and their home language. And we believe because for English learners, having that collaborative piece and the involvement of ESL experts, the recommendations and resources regarding interdisciplinary decision-making have a lot of rich implications for how we work with dually identified English learners, develop IEPs for English learners. So we're going to talk a little bit more about collaboration and do a little interactivity in a second. So if you can look in the chat real quick before we move on to the next activity. So within this activity, we're going to look at the link that Sarah posted. So if everyone can look at the chat really quick. The link that Sarah posted that says, this really long, crazy URL, simplify my.s3, blah, 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 ends with collaboration continuum. I'll talk through it, so you don't need to read the whole thing. But if you want to look at that, that tool as we talk about the next, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes for us to do a little bit of self-analysis regarding our teams and how we're doing as far as collaboration. Where are we in terms of having shared goals and that kind of thing. So this is just a tool that was used by the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs to look at collaboration. So If you want to open that up, and I will just quickly talk through the 5 levels. So I think, Jenny, we can stay maybe in this view for a minute so that they have the link there if they want to look at that. I'll talk through the 5 levels, and then we'll switch to our poll. So you have the first level of collaboration in this view is contact, where you have shared ideas and information. So open, honest dialogue encourages exploration of commonalities, development of relationships to facilitate discussion of potential activities. So you're talking to one another, you're sharing some ideas, but that's kind of it so far. The second is cooperation or shared goals. So in cooperation, relationship building fosters the development of cooperative activities. Because it's a process, it often begins with informal engagements that offer small yet tangible benefits. So it sometimes occurs only one way, for example, information or data sharing. So there's some action involved, some goals that are common to the team members, but that's sort of as far as it's gone. The third level they talk about is coordination, shared achievement of goals. So these cooperative activities move beyond as needed or ad hoc. A framework organizes efforts and ensures that everyone in the group understands who does what, when, and where, so there's some structure. Activities are planned with consideration given to schedules and staff availability, and communication tools may be developed to support coordination efforts. So it relies on formal or informal agreements to achieve a desired common outcome. So we're moving a little bit more structured, a little bit more regular in this third level called coordination. The fourth level they have is collaboration, where you have shared resources. So information is not only shared, but something new is created. It's a new way of doing things that involves change. The change required is more ambitious than cooperation and coordination, and much more difficult to develop and sustain. That's collaboration. So the fifth level they call convergence, and they describe that as systemic infrastructure. So this is collaboration about a specific function or idea, and that has become extensive, ingrained in that context. So it's no longer recognized to others as a collaborative undertaking. It instead has moved to the level of infrastructure, becomes a critical system that is relied upon. That's convergence. So as you go along this continuum, you get a little more investment, a little more risk, but also a little bit more of a benefit. So in thinking about that, hopefully you guys have either looked at that or been thinking about it as I was talking through it. So Jenny, we can move to the poll now, I think. So we wanted to have you guys just think a little bit about where your team, or if you're meeting as an individual, think about people you work with in your school or district. Where is your school or district on this continuum? Is there contact, where you're just sharing some ideas? Is there cooperation, where you have common goals? Is there coordination, where you're shared achievement of goals? Collaboration, where you're really sharing resources, creating something new, it's starting to become systemic, or convergence, where it's really ingrained, a systemic infrastructure. And then feel free to share also in the chat to the right, what is one way that you or your colleagues have improved collaboration in your local context. So if you have an idea of something practical that you've done that you feel like has helped you collaborate with others in your local context, that would be great to share as well. Okay, great. Thank you for posting your thoughts. Okay, so it looks like we're sort of skewed toward the bottom part of the continuum. 40% of you, well, it's changing as I talk. 36 just contact, where you're sharing some ideas, some cooperation, shared goals. A couple saying coordination, shared achievement of goals, and one individual or group saying that their team has reached the collaboration shared resources stage. So, all right, and we have a couple of comments shared as well. We have Kathy Bosco. Thanks for responding. She's saying, by using a developmental language plan, it has solidified student programs for individual measures and growth, while also providing PD as needed for certain teams of teachers based on population. That's why I'm feeling that our district is somewhere between coordination and collaboration. Great. And then Colchester is sharing that their team meets on a regular basis, including the EL specialist, administrators, and support staff to discuss concerns, updates, etc. Fantastic. So it sounds like some of you are really engaging in a little bit more structured kinds of collaboration, and that's great. I think for those of you who are still trying to encourage a little bit more collaboration, I would definitely recommend taking a look at the San Diego report. It has some really great tools in there, as well as just thinking about some of those characteristics of teams that they said. Maybe you try to implement a one-day-a-week 30-minute meeting with some key folks or something like that. So hopefully these resources can help in continuing to grow in this area amongst your team as well. Okay, so I think we can move along. So the second recommendation from the CCSSO guide about developing IEPs for English learners is that parents should be integral members of IEP teams, partners in the process, instead of simply informed about what's going on or used as resources. Even those are important elements of their role as well. As we've discussed throughout the series, they're an important source of data about the students, and they're important partners in the process. You could look at the ethnographic interview guidance in the San Diego report, as I mentioned, as one resource. And parents' thoughts and feedback about services that are needed should be incorporated throughout the process. So some strategies for parent and family engagement in developing IEPs are providing translators for meetings with parents. That could be an in-person translator or a translation service over the phone or the internet. Consider whether translators have experience with education, RTI, and special education, and perhaps even training some translators on the state or district's RTI and special education processes and policies, since some of these things do get tricky, sort of technical, so it may be something to think about that whether there are some translators who you might engage in some of this learning about the process specifically. There are communication tools that you can create that may go a long way in helping families engage with this process. Maybe a document, a video, audio, in families' home languages if possible. I know some of you are dealing with many home languages, so we know that can be a challenge. But as possible, glossaries of key terms used in ESL and special education with definition in English and other languages as possible. That may be really helpful to some of these families engaging in these conversations for the first time. You can do structured interviews, as we mentioned, and you might consider, too, if there's a family who has a really good understanding of the RTI process, special education, maybe their kid has been involved in this for a while, you might consider having them work with additional parents. So thinking about families who really understand and might themselves serve as resources and could take some of the burden off of you all as well. Okay. The third recommendation from the CCSSO guide is to consider a student's progress in English language development related to the state's ELP standards, so the CELT, when writing academic learning goals for duly identified students. So we've discussed throughout the series students' English language proficiency should be considered when making instructional decisions for them, both within the data analysis and in the planning for instruction. Academic learning goals are accomplished via use of language, and of course we need to also help students continue to develop their English language proficiency. So when considering and incorporating English language development into a student's IEP, your team could think about and plan ways to incorporate a student's home language, which is of course an important support, as well as other academic learning. In addition, again, multiple data points should be incorporated into progress monitoring plans, and these should include information on students' progress with both English language development as well as other academic learning goals. And note that this is important for all English learners with disabilities, even those who produce little or no oral speech. Their English language development is still an important element of their education and should be addressed in whatever way is appropriate for that student. For this recommendation, I'm going to post in the chat a couple of other resources for you. One is a website on Coloring Colorado, which some of you might be familiar with that website. They have a site that is specifically about IEPs for English learners. They have a few videos there which may be helpful. In one video, they address that often when decisions are made regarding IEP development, the disability takes precedence, and maybe the student is even taken out of ESL or bilingual instruction. But they make the point that you need strong native language skills also to help learn English and address other learning goals as well. There's a video there as well on progress monitoring, how to get data when school records are scarce, which we've talked about. Sometimes with a newcomer, it may be difficult to identify some of their information, and they talk about both conversations with parents and dynamic assessment, so that's something else that may be useful in your thinking. And here's one more resource. This is an IEP checklist from San Joaquin County based on the work of Jerice Butterfield. Hopefully I'm saying her name right, I'm not sure. And it includes language supports that an IEP team could choose to incorporate for students, so that may be something as you're thinking about IEPs for English learners and working with a team, that may be something that could offer some additional thoughts and scaffolds to help with your planning. So just a couple of other practical resources for you to consider. So the final and fourth recommendation from the CCSSO guide on developing IEPs for English learners is that training should be offered to a variety of personnel involved in EL IEP development, including special education personnel, general education teachers, and ESOL professionals. So while including ESL experts is critical to the process, regardless of training provided to other educators, provision of training to all educators involved will greatly enhance the ability of the whole team to appropriately address English learners' learning needs. So some things to consider for training that your district could choose to provide for educators. It could include a discussion about aligning English language goals with other academic learning goals. We've discussed this with interventions and the whole SRBI process, how important it is to integrate English language development with other learning goals. So that could be something that your district could consider maybe doing some more in-depth training about. In addition, there are unique and complementary roles for English language services and special education services. And so you might talk with teams further about the ways that these roles can play complementary, can be complementary to one another. And then I wanted to post one final resource for you. So this is a link to a PowerPoint presentation, but it has some examples of IEPs for English learners. So you might find that useful as you think about developing these IEPs and some of the ways in which you can incorporate English language development. You may find that PowerPoint useful as well, because they do have specific examples of how they've done that with English learners. So that brings us to if anyone has any questions. We know we've once again discussed a lot today and have covered a lot of information, but if you have questions or final comments, ideas, thoughts, we'd love to hear anything that's on your mind. Okay. We don't see any questions, but you should have our contact information, and since this is our last session, if you have follow-on questions, we would be happy to hear from you anytime, of course. All right, so I'll pass it back to Sarah to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Lindsey. Lots of valuable, realistic, practical resources. So we just wanted to take a couple minutes to talk through team planning, since that's sort of a fundamental part of how we're trying to frame these sessions. So summary of today's learning, our goals were to equip participants with the knowledge and skills to make better informed decisions, reflect on all the content from the past couple sessions, and identify concrete next steps for applying strategies, recommendations, and considerations for you all. So what we would suggest, and we understand that one way that this has maybe been playing out is that you've planned to stick around and continue chatting after the close of the session, is discuss with your team the guiding questions that we have here. What are the implications of today's learning for your practice? And what's one action step you'd like to take tomorrow, an action step for this month, and an action step for this year? So we'll give folks a couple of questions if you want to share thoughts on those in the chat. Okay, so we'll move along. We just wanted to request that you share feedback by taking the survey that is linked in the chat box. And here's our contact information for additional questions. And Ashley, I'll let you close us out.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. As I said earlier, today's webinar is being recorded or was recorded, and it will be archived and uploaded to the IES YouTube channel. We will send you a link when that recording is available to the public, and we will also be sending you a follow-up email with all slides and materials that were used in this webinar. Thank you, excuse me, again for participating in this series, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.